Did medieval parents even like their children? It's a fair question. We picture a world of filth, disease, and brutal survival. A world where half of all children died before they reached their teens. The common story is that parents kept their kids at an emotional distance. Why get attached to someone who is probably going to die? They were seen as little adults put to work as soon as they could walk and beaten into obedience. It was a hard world, and it made for hard people. But what if that story is wrong? Or at least, what if it's only half the story? We see the skeletons and the statistics. We read the grim laws, but we often miss the whispers. The lullabies sung to a crying baby. The tender advice written down by a monk. The tiny, worn-out leather shoes found in the mud of a London riverbank. These things tell a different story. A story of deep love, surprising gentleness, and a kind of parental wisdom we think we invented. What if the medieval parent wasn't a monster, but just a person? A person trying to raise a good kid in a dangerous world using the tools they had. What if some of their tools, some of their ideas were actually kinder than we give them credit for? Maybe even kinder than some of our own. We think we know everything about parenting now, with our apps and our experts. But did a mother in 13th century France know something we've forgotten about soothing a child? Did a father in 15th century England have a better way to teach patience than a timeout? Let's look past the cliches and see what we can find. The answers might change how we see them, and maybe how we see ourselves. Number 16, was a mother's milk just food, or was it love? We tend to think of medieval aristocrats as cold. A baby is born, and it's immediately handed off to a wet nurse. The mother goes back to her duties. It seems like a transaction, a way to outsource the messiness of infancy. And for many high-status women, this was the reality. They needed to get pregnant again quickly to produce more heirs, and breastfeeding can delay the return of fertility. So, yes, wet nursing was a big business, but that's not the whole picture. For most people, and even in the advice given to the rich, a mother's own milk was seen as the absolute best thing for a child. This wasn't just about nutrition, it was about something much deeper. They believed that milk wasn't just food. It was a substance that carried a mother's essence, her character, her love. The 13th century Franciscan friar Bartholomew Anglicus wrote one of the most popular encyclopedias of the Middle Ages, De Proprietatibus Rerum, on the properties of things. He was clear about it. He said a mother should love her child intensely and feed it herself. He believed nursing created a physical and spiritual bond that was irreplaceable. When he described the ideal wet nurse, he wasn't just looking for someone who produced a lot of milk. He insisted she be of good character, patient, and not prone to anger. Why? Because it was believed that these moral qualities would pass through the milk into the child. If a nurse was angry or sad, her milk could literally poison the baby's spirit. This idea was everywhere. The church promoted it heavily. The most common image of the Virgin Mary in the late Middle Ages wasn't as a queen in heaven. It was the Maria Lactans, the nursing Mary. She was shown with her breast exposed, feeding the baby Jesus. This was the ultimate model for motherhood. It was holy, tender, and deeply personal. It sent a powerful message to every woman in every church. This is what a good mother does. You don't just feed your child's body, you feed their soul. Think about what that means. We talked today about the bonding experience of breastfeeding, about the hormone oxytocin creating feelings of love and connection. They didn't have the science, but they understood the result. They saw that a mother holding her child close, giving of her own body, was an act of profound love. It was a way of shaping the child's entire being from the very first day. The advice wasn't to keep a distance. The advice was to draw the child as close as possible. Of course, the reality was complicated. For a peasant woman working in the fields, stopping to nurse was a part of the daily rhythm, right? It was natural and necessary. For a queen, it was a political calculation. But the underlying belief, the ideal that everyone was taught, was that a mother's milk was best because it was filled with her love. It was the first and most important lesson in becoming a good person. It wasn't a chore to be outsourced. It was a sacred duty. What did they know that we've forgotten? We sometimes medicalize feeding so much, counting ounces and checking charts. We forget the simple, powerful idea that feeding a child is also about communicating love, security, and a sense of belonging. The medievals, in their own way, had that part figured out. But how much of this was ideal versus reality? What did a mother do if she simply couldn't produce milk in an age before formula? How much guilt and spiritual fear did that cause? If a child raised by a short-tempered, wet nurse grew up to be difficult, was the nurse blamed for her bad milk years later? And what was the true psychological impact on aristocratic children who spent their first 2 years with a loving nurse only to be taken away and returned to parents they barely knew? Number 15. Did they force children to be silent, or did they listen to their questions? The image is a classic one. Children should be seen and not heard. This is a phrase we often associate with the past, with a strict authoritarian style of parenting. We imagine medieval children standing silently in the presence of adults, too scared to speak out of turn. And certainly, respect for elders was a cornerstone of their society. Formal manners were important. But there's a huge difference between teaching a child manners and demanding they be silent robots. The evidence suggests that, surprisingly, medieval thinkers were very interested in a child's curiosity. They saw it not as an annoyance, but as a vital tool for learning and for developing a moral compass. The key was not to crush their questions, but to guide them toward the right answers. Consider Anselm of Canterbury, an 11th century abbot and philosopher. He tells a story in his writings about another abbot who was complaining about the boys being raised in his monastery. The abbot said they were perverse and incorrigible. No matter how much he beat them, they just got worse. Anselm's response is astonishingly modern. He asks the abbot, "You beat them, and when they are grown up, what do they become?" The abbot replies, "Stupid and brutish." Anselm then uses a powerful analogy. He asks if a goldsmith made a statue by just beating a sheet of gold with a hammer. "No," he says. The goldsmith gently presses and taps, carefully shaping the material. He tells the abbot to do the same with the boys. He should use patience, kindness, and guidance. Anselm's core argument was about dialogue. He believed you had to engage with a child's mind. You had to answer their questions. This wasn't a fringe idea. The whole model of education at the time, at least for those who got one, was based on the catechism attacks a system of questions and answers. A teacher would ask a question and the student would respond. This format encourages thinking, not just rote memorization. It teaches a child how to think, how to structure an argument, how to reason their way to a conclusion. We also see this in the literature of the time. There were many popular texts written as a dialogue between a father and a son, or a master and a student. The Lucidarium, a 12th century text, for example, is structured as a series of questions from a student to his teacher covering everything from theology to the natural world. This showed a cultural respect for the act of questioning. It was the primary way knowledge was passed down. Why would this be any different in the home? Parents told stories, especially Bible stories in saints' lives. These were not just meant to be listened to passively, they were meant to provoke questions. Why was Daniel not afraid of the lions? What does it mean to be a martyr? These questions were the whole point. They were opportunities for moral instruction. So, while a child might have been expected to be quiet during a formal dinner with a visiting lord, the everyday reality of their education and upbringing involved a lot of talking. It involved asking questions and having those questions taken seriously. They understood that a child's mind is not an empty bucket to be filled, but a fire to be lit. The goal wasn't to create a silent, obedient drone. The goal was to create a thinking, reasoning Christian who understood why the rules were the way they were. And you can't do that without letting them ask why. But how widespread was this enlightened view? Anselm was a highly educated church leader. Did the average peasant farmer have the time or the inclination to patiently answer his child's endless questions after a day of backbreaking labor? Did girls get the same opportunity to ask questions as boys, or was their curiosity channeled in more restrictive domestic directions? And when a child's questions verged on heresy or challenged the authority of the church or the father, how quickly did gentle dialogue turn into a harsh command to be silent? Number 14 was swaddling a cage, or was it a comfort? Nothing looks more alien to modern parenting than a swaddled medieval baby. We see illustrations of infants wrapped up as tight as a mummy, unable to move their arms or legs, sometimes even strapped to a board. Our first reaction is horror. It looks like a tiny, helpless prisoner. We think of attachment, movement, and sensory exploration as crucial for development. The swaddling seems to be the exact opposite of all of that. The conventional interpretation has often been negative. Historians like Lloyd DeMause, a proponent of what's called psychohistory, argued that swaddling was a form of parental abuse. He claimed it was born from a deep-seated hostility towards infants, a way to keep them quiet and out of the way, preventing them from touching themselves or wriggling like a worm. It was, in this view, the physical manifestation of emotional abandonment. But there's a much gentler and probably more accurate way to look at it. To understand swaddling, you have to get inside the medieval mindset. First, they lived in a world without central heating. Houses were drafty and cold. Swaddling was a practical way to keep a baby warm. It was like a permanent wearable blanket. A baby that can't kick off its covers is a baby that won't freeze in the middle of the night. Second, they believed a newborn's body was incredibly fragile, almost like soft clay. They thought that without support, a baby's limbs could grow crooked. Swaddling was seen as a way to help the baby grow straight and strong, to protect its delicate limbs from flailing around and potentially getting injured. It wasn't about restriction for its own sake, it was about protection and proper physical formation. The 16th century surgeon Ambroise Paré, whose work was based on centuries of earlier medical knowledge, gave detailed instructions on how to swaddle a baby gently, ensuring the limbs were straight to guide their growth. Most importantly, they may have understood something we are only now rediscovering with our modern fourth trimester theories. The world is a loud, bright, scary place for a newborn. After 9 months in the tight, dark, muffled environment of the womb, being out in the open can be overwhelming. Swaddling mimics the snug, secure feeling of the womb. It can calm a baby's startle reflex and help them feel safe and contained. Modern parents who swaddle their newborns often report that they sleep better and cry less. The medieval parent who carefully wrapped their infant was likely not thinking, "I want to imprison my child." They were probably thinking, "I want my child to feel safe, warm, and calm." So it was an act of comfort. Medical texts from the period, like the Trotula from 12th century Salerno, Italy, a collection of works on women's medicine, talk about bathing the baby in warm water and gently massaging it with oil before swaddling it in soft, clean linen. This doesn't sound like a ritual of abuse. It sounds like a loving, soothing routine. They were doing the best they could with the knowledge they had to protect and comfort their vulnerable new baby. It wasn't a cage, it was a cocoon. Still, we have to ask, did they leave babies swaddled for too long, potentially delaying motor development? How did they handle cleaning a swaddled baby, and did this lead to skin problems and infections we can't see in the historical record? And was there a darker side? In households where parents were overwhelmed or neglectful, did this tool of comfort become a tool of convenience, allowing a baby to be left alone for dangerously long periods? At what point does a cocoon become a prison? Number 13, did they beat children into submission, or did they believe in reasoned discipline? Spare the rod and spoil the child. This quote, derived from the Bible, is the bedrock of what we assume about medieval discipline. We imagine a world where physical punishment was constant, harsh, and the primary tool for teaching. Children were beaten by parents, by schoolmasters, by apprenticeship masters. And to be clear, corporal punishment was absolutely a part of their world. It was common and widely accepted as necessary. But to say it was the only tool, or that it was always done without thought or restraint, is a gross oversimplification. Many medieval thinkers advocated for a much more nuanced approach. They saw the rod as a last resort, not a first response. The goal of discipline wasn't to inflict pain, but to correct a child's soul and guide them toward virtue. And many believed that this was best achieved through words, not blows. Let's go back to Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century. His story about the abbot who only beat the boys is a powerful critique of mindless physical punishment. Anselm's point was that beating only creates fear and resentment, not understanding. It makes children stupid and brutish. Instead, he advocated for gentle management, patience, and kindness. This wasn't some radical, unheard of idea. It was part of a long tradition in Christian thought that emphasized inner transformation over outward compliance. By the 14th century, we see this idea being spelled out in more detail. The Italian writer Paolo da Certaldo wrote a book of advice for his sons. He advised that a father should correct his child with words first. He said you should only resort to physical punishment if the child is older, he suggests over the age of 7, and if they are committing a serious moral failing, not just for being childish. And even then, it should be done with a sense of sorrow, not anger. The goal was correction, not vengeance. Even the rules for schoolmasters, who have a reputation for being particularly brutal, often included calls for restraint. The statutes for a 15th century school in England, for example, specified that the master should be a man of patience and should not strike the boys cruelly. There was a recognition that excessive violence was counterproductive. It damaged the child and shamed the adult. The key distinction they made was between anger and discipline. To beat a child in a fit of rage was a sin. It was the adult losing control. True, godly discipline was meant to be calm, considered, and motivated by love. The parent was supposed to explain the child's fault to them. They were supposed to make the child understand why they were being punished. This was about saving their immortal soul, which was the most important parental duty of all. A beating for spilling milk was tyranny. A measured punishment for lying, preceded by a lecture on the importance of truth, was seen as a parent's solemn obligation. So, while we see images of teachers with bundles of birch rods, we should also imagine a mother patiently explaining a Bible story, or a father seriously discussing the consequences of dishonesty with his son. They believed in a hierarchy of discipline first, loving words and instruction second, sharp rebukes and warnings, and only third, when all else failed, the rod. It's a far cry from the image of constant, unthinking brutality we so often hold. But what was the line between measured and cruel, punishment and practice? How often did adults, living stressful and often violent lives themselves, cross that line from loving correction into angry abuse? Did the emphasis on breaking a child's willful pride lead to psychological damage that we would recognize today as trauma? And how did a child experience this? Did they truly understand the distinction between a corrective blow and an angry one? At number 12, were children just miniature adults, or did they have a childhood? One of the most influential and controversial ideas about medieval children came from the French historian Philippe Aries in his 1960 book, Centuries of Childhood. Aries argued that the very concept of childhood, as a distinct stage of life, didn't exist in the Middle Ages. He looked at medieval art and saw children depicted as small, strangely proportioned adults. He read about them being integrated into the adult world of work and social life from around the age of 7. His conclusion was that as soon as a child was past the initial stage of physical dependency, they were simply seen as an adult in training, without any special psychological or emotional needs. This idea was hugely popular for a long time. It fit neatly with the Dark Ages narrative of a harsh and unsentimental world. But since Aries, a whole generation of historians like Nicholas Orme and Shulamith Shahar has looked at the evidence more closely and come to a very different conclusion. They argue that medieval people were perfectly aware that children were different from adults. They just expressed it differently than we do. For a start, they had words to describe the different stages of life. Latin, the language of the educated, had infans, a baby who can't speak, puer a boy up to about 14, and adolescents a youth. They clearly recognized these as distinct periods with their own characteristics. Medical and philosophical texts also made these distinctions. Bartholomew Anglicus, in his 13th century encyclopedia, has a whole section on children. He describes them as being soft of flesh, light of heart, easily angered and easily pleased and forgetful. He notes that they need lots of sleep and that their bodies and minds are in a constant state of change. This is not a description of a miniature adult, it's a description of a child. Their legal systems also treated children differently. In most parts of medieval Europe, children under a certain age, often 7 or 12, could not be held fully responsible for crimes. They were seen as lacking discretion or the ability to reason like an adult. This is a fundamental legal recognition that childhood is a unique state. The church, too, had different expectations. A child was not expected to fast as rigorously as an adult during Lent, for example. And what about the art? Yes, children in formal portraits sometimes look like tiny adults. But that was a convention of the art style. It wasn't a reflection of reality. When you look at more informal art, in the margins of manuscripts, for instance, you see very different images. You see children playing, tumbling, and behaving in very childlike ways. They are drawn with a liveliness and energy that is clearly distinct from the stiff, formal adults. The idea that childhood ended at 7 is also a misunderstanding. 7 was an important age. It was often called the age of reason, the point at which a child was thought to be able to distinguish right from wrong. This is why it was often the age when formal education or apprenticeship might begin. But this wasn't a sudden plunge into the adult world, it was the beginning of a long, slow transition. An apprentice at age 8 was not doing the same work as a master craftsman of 30. He was given simple, age-appropriate tasks, and the apprenticeship itself was a form of education that lasted for many years. They had a concept of adolescence, a transitional period, filled with its own challenges and follies. Medieval people knew a 14-year-old was not a 40-year-old, so yes, medieval childhood was different from ours. It was often shorter. Children took on responsibilities earlier, but the evidence that they recognized it as a special, protected, and distinct phase of life is overwhelming. They knew kids weren't just small adults, they knew they were something else entirely. But if they recognized childhood as a distinct stage, why did they seem so eager to move children into adult roles and responsibilities? Was this driven purely by economic necessity, or was there a philosophical belief that idleness in youth was dangerous? How did the experience of childhood differ between a peasant girl, a noble boy, and a child given to a monastery as an oblate? And if they had a concept of adolescence, why does so much of their moral literature seem to treat teenagers as uniquely sinful and dangerous? It's number 11. Was play a waste of time or a tool for learning? In a world where every hand was needed for survival, was there even time for play? The stereotypical view is that medieval children were put to work as soon as they could walk, their days filled with chores, not games. Play seems like a modern luxury, something that only became central to childhood when we no longer needed kids to work the fields or spin wool. The reality, however, is that medieval children played a lot, and adults, for the most part, saw this as a natural and necessary part of growing up. They understood that play wasn't just frivolous, it was how children learned about the world and their place in it. The 13th century theologian Thomas Aquinas even wrote that play was necessary for the repose of the soul. If even a serious theologian could see the value of play, it's a good sign that it was an accepted part of life. And archaeology gives us some of the most charming evidence. All across Europe, archaeologists have found medieval toys. There are tiny clay knights, little pottery animals, carved wooden dolls, and spinning tops made of bone or wood. They've found marbles made of clay and stone. In London, they found a small, beautifully crafted pewter toy set of plates, jugs, and goblets, a medieval doll's tea set. These weren't just random objects, they were made for children. They show us that children then, as now, loved to imitate the adult world around them. The little boy playing with a toy knight wasn't just having fun, he was learning about the social roles and ideals of his culture. A girl with a doll and a miniature pot was learning the domestic skills she would one day need. We also see play depicted in art. The famous 1560 painting Children's Games by Peter Bruegel. The Elder is from a slightly later period, but it depicts games that had been played for centuries. It shows more than 200 children playing over 80 different games. They are rolling hoops, walking on stilts, playing leapfrog, blind man's bluff, and games with dolls and hobby horses. It's a scene of chaotic, joyful energy. While this is a single famous example, similar scenes and descriptions of games can be found in manuscript illuminations and in the writings of the time. Moralists and educators didn't try to stamp out play. Instead, they tried to guide it. They distinguished between good play and bad play. Good play was anything that developed useful skills or was harmless fun. Running, jumping, wrestling, and games that imitated adult work were all seen as positive. They built strong bodies and taught social rules. Bad play was anything that involved gambling, like playing with dice for money, or play that was cruel or led to sin. The concern wasn't with play itself, but with its potential for moral corruption. Even in the most serious of environments, like monasteries where boys were being trained as monks, time was set aside for recreation. They understood that children simply couldn't work or study all day long. They needed an outlet for their energy. Play was a safety valve, a necessary part of a balanced life. It was a recognition of the fundamental nature of being a child. They might not have had the language of developmental psychology, but they knew that children learn by doing, by imitating, and by playing. But how much time did a typical peasant child really have for play amidst the demands of farm life? were the toys we find in archaeological digs, common possessions, or rare treasures for a privileged few. And when did the adult world intervene? At what point did a boy's play with a wooden sword turn into serious and dangerous training with a real one? Did adults join in the games, or was play a world that belonged exclusively to children? Number 10, were lullabies just for sleep, or were they a child's first lessons? A mother humming to her baby is one of the most universal human experiences. It's an instinct, and medieval mothers were no different. They sang lullabies. We might think of these as simple, repetitive tunes meant only to soothe a child to sleep. And they were that. But they were also much more, they were often a child's very first introduction to language, to culture, and to the moral and spiritual framework of their world. No, we don't have recordings, of course, but we have the lyrics. Many medieval lullabies have been preserved in manuscripts. One of the most famous and beautiful is the Lule, My Child, and Wept No More. It's written from the perspective of the Virgin Mary singing to the baby Jesus. On the surface, it's a tender song from a mother to her crying child. She tells him to sleep softly, that she will rock him and hold him. It's full of love and gentleness, but woven into it is the whole story of Christianity. She sings about the bitter passion he will one day face, about the cross, and about the salvation of mankind. This might seem shockingly dark to us. Why sing to a baby about his future suffering and death? But for the medieval mind, this was perfectly normal. A child's life on earth was just a preface to their eternal life in heaven. The most important job of a parent was to prepare their child's soul for salvation. And that education started in the cradle. A lullaby wasn't just a sleepy time song. It was a prayer, it was a sermon, it was a way of embedding the most fundamental truths of their faith into a child's mind before they could even understand the words. The rhythm, the melody, the mother's loving voice, all of this would create a deep emotional connection to the content of the song. There were secular lullabies too, of course. Some were simple folk songs about animals or daily life. Others were more like warnings. There are lullabies that mention frightening figures like wolves or goblins that might come and get a child who doesn't sleep. This might seem cruel, but it was part of a world where real dangerous animals, bandits, the unknown darkness were very present. These songs were a way of teaching a child about the world, its wonders and its dangers in a controlled, rhythmic way. The act of singing itself was a form of gentle parenting. It's a physical act of connection. And a mother singing to her baby is regulating her own breathing, her own heart rate, which in turn can calm the baby. She is focused entirely on the child. In a world with few material comforts, a mother's voice was a powerful tool for creating a sense of security and love. It was a way of wrapping the child in a blanket of sound. These lullabies show us that the education of a child, especially their moral and spiritual education, didn't start at age 7 in a classroom. It started on day 1, in the arms of a parent. It was gentle, persistent, and woven into the most intimate moments of a child's life. The songs were simple enough for a baby to be soothed by, but deep enough to contain the entire worldview of the culture. But what were the lullabies of the common people really like, the ones that were never written down? How much do they differ from the overtly religious ones composed by clerics? Did singing these dark theological lullabies actually create a sense of anxiety in young children? And could the use of frightening figures in lullabies be seen as an early form of emotional manipulation to enforce obedience? What does it do to a child's mind to associate sleep and a mother's love with images of future suffering or lurking monsters? Number 9. Was storytelling just entertainment or a moral compass? Long before television, before the internet, before even widespread literacy, there was storytelling. It was the primary form of entertainment and education. For a medieval child, stories were not just a fun way to pass a long winter evening. They were the instruction manual for life. They provided the moral compass, the social map, and the cultural identity that would guide them into adulthood. Parents and community elders were the primary storytellers. They would gather children around the fire and tell the great tales. There were the lives of the saints, which were the ultimate superhero stories of the age. St. George and the Dragon taught courage and faith. St. Nicholas, the secret gift giver, taught charity. And St. Margaret, who was swallowed by a dragon and burst out of its side, taught resilience and the power of God. These weren't just dusty old tales. They were exciting adventures filled with miracles, monsters, and heroes. And every story had a clear moral: be brave, be faithful, be charitable. and you will be rewarded in heaven. Then there were the Bible stories, the epic tales of the Old Testament. David and Goliath, Noah's Ark, Daniel and the lion's den were told and retold. They were filled with action, drama, and clear lessons about obedience to God, the consequences of sin, and the rewards of faith. The parables of Jesus from the New Testament, like the Good Samaritan or the prodigal son, provided more subtle and complex lessons about mercy, forgiveness, and love. But it wasn't all religious. There were also the great romances and epic poems. Tales of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table taught the ideals of chivalry, honor, loyalty, and protecting the weak. Stories like Beowulf, passed down from an earlier age, taught about courage in the face of monstrous evil. And there were countless folk tales and fables, populated by clever foxes, foolish wolves, and magical creatures. These stories, like Aesop's fables, which were very popular in the Middle Ages, taught practical wisdom about not being greedy, about being clever, and about the dangers of trusting the wrong people. This was not a passive experience. Storytelling was interactive. Children would ask questions. They would cheer for the hero and boo the villain. They would absorb the rhythms of the language and the structures of the plots. This is how they learned to make sense of the world. They learned to recognize archetypes, the hero, the trickster, the wise old man, the damsel in distress. They learned to understand cause and effect, sin and redemption, good and evil. This form of education is incredibly gentle and effective. It doesn't feel like a lesson. It feels like an adventure. A parent wasn't saying, here's a list of rules you must follow. They were saying, let me tell you a story about a brave knight. The lessons were embedded in a narrative that was emotionally engaging and memorable. The values of the culture were absorbed naturally, almost by osmosis. It was a way of shaping a child's conscience and imagination at the same time. But how much did children understand the complex theology embedded in these stories? And how much were they just enjoying the battles and monsters? Were stories used to frighten children into obedience, with tales of demons and hellfire being more common than tales of mercy and love? How did the stories told to girls, likely focused on piety and domestic virtues, differ from the epic tales of battle and adventure told to boys, and how did this shape their understanding of their place in the world? Number 8 was nature an enemy or a playground? The medieval world was overwhelmingly rural. Most people lived in small villages, surrounded by forests, fields, and rivers. We often imagine this world as hostile. The forest was dark and dangerous, filled with wolves, boars, and outlaws. The weather was unpredictable and could ruin a harvest, leading to famine. Nature was something to be tamed, feared, and overcome. For a child, however, this same environment could be a giant, thrilling playground. While adults saw the forest as a source of firewood and danger, a child saw it as a place to explore, to build forts, to climb trees. The river, where adults worked washing clothes or watering animals, was, for a child, a place to splash, to catch minnows, and to sail little wooden boats. This wasn't something that parents formally encouraged, but it was an unavoidable part of a rural childhood. With parents working long hours in the fields, children had a degree of freedom and unsupervised time that is almost unimaginable today. This immersion in the natural world was a powerful form of education. A child learned to read the seasons, to know which berries were safe to eat and which were poisonous. They learned the tracks of different animals. They learned the properties of different types of wood and stone. This was practical, hands-on, sensory learning. It taught them to be observant, self-reliant, and resilient. A child who spent their days outdoors would develop a physical confidence and a deep, intuitive understanding of their local environment. The literature of the time is full of references to the natural world, suggesting how deeply it was embedded in their consciousness. Seasons and agricultural cycles provided the rhythm for life and for the stories they told. And religious teaching often used metaphors from nature. Jesus was the good shepherd. The faithful were his flock. The kingdom of heaven was like a mustard seed. This way of thinking came naturally to people who lived their lives in close connection with the land. Children would have understood these metaphors in a very direct and physical way. Even the games they played were often tied to the natural world. They made dolls from corn husks, played with conkers or acorns, and wove crowns from wildflowers. The outdoors was their toy box. This wasn't a scheduled 30-minute nature walk like we might plan for our kids today. It was their entire world. This relationship with nature was, in its own way, a form of gentle parenting provided by the environment itself. It allowed children to learn at their own pace, to follow their own curiosity. It let them take small, calculated risks and learn from their mistakes. Falling out of a low tree branch was a painful but effective lesson in physics and judgment. This freedom while born of necessity, allowed for a kind of deep experiential learning that is often missing from a modern, more structured and screen-based childhood. They were not taught about nature, they grew up in it. It shaped their bodies, their minds, and their imaginations. But how do we balance this idyllic picture with the very real dangers of a medieval childhood? How many children drowned in rivers, were lost in the woods, or were injured with no access to medical care? Was this freedom just a form of neglect born from the economic desperation of their parents? And did this early immersion in nature create a lifelong respect for the environment, or did it simply teach them to see it as a resource to be exploited for human survival? Number 7, were children isolated or raised by a village? The modern ideal is the nuclear family, 2 parents, couple of kids, living in their own home. We put immense pressure on parents, especially mothers, to be everything for their children: the teacher, the nurse, the chef, the entertainer, the therapist. This is a relatively new invention. In the Middle Ages, the idea of a family being so isolated and self-contained would have been bizarre. A child wasn't raised by 2 parents. A child was raised by a village. This started with the concept of godparents. Today, being a godparent is often a symbolic role. In the Middle Ages, it was a sacred and practical bond. At a child's baptism, godparents made a formal spiritual commitment to help raise the child in the Christian faith. This wasn't just a promise to send a gift once a year. It meant they were responsible for the child's spiritual education. If the child's parents died, godparents were often the first choice to become legal guardians. It created a web of kinship that extended beyond blood ties. A child had other adults in their life who were formally invested in their welfare. This provided a crucial safety net in a world with high mortality rates. Beyond the godparents, there was the wider community. In a small village, everyone knew everyone else's children. People lived and worked in close proximity. A child running through the village would be watched over by a dozen pairs of eyes. An older woman might offer a piece of bread, a blacksmith might shoo them away from the forge, a neighbor might scold them for being too rough. It was a constant, informal system of community supervision and care. Children learn social rules not just from their parents, but from the entire community. Extended family was also central. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins often lived in the same household or very close by. His older siblings were also key caregivers. It was perfectly normal for a 10-year-old to be in charge of their 4-year-old sibling for much of the day. This wasn't seen as burdening the older child. It was seen as their natural role and a vital part of their own education in responsibility and care. This system provided a kind of gentle, diffused parenting. A child had multiple sources of affection, guidance, and discipline. If a mother was overwhelmed or a father was stern, a child might find a sympathetic ear from an aunt or a grandfather. This distribution of the emotional and practical load of child rearing was arguably much healthier than the intense, often isolated model we have today. It relieved the pressure on parents and gave the child a wider sense of belonging and security. They were not just a member of a small family, they were a member of a community. But what was the downside of this collective upbringing? Did everyone's business mean a child had no privacy and was subject to constant gossip and judgment? In a tightly knit community, how much pressure was there to conform, and what happened to the child who was different or rebellious? And was the care provided by older siblings and the wider community always gentle, or could it also be a source of bullying and abuse that went unchecked by busy parents? Number 6, were children burdened with chores or empowered by responsibility? We look at paintings of medieval peasant life and see children working alongside adults in the fields. We read about them starting apprenticeships at a young age. Our modern sensibility often views this as child labor, a cruel theft of their childhood. We believe childhood should be a time free from the burdens of work, a time for play and education. There's no question that medieval children worked, and often they worked very hard. From a young age, they were expected to contribute to the family economy. A small child might be tasked with scaring birds away from the crops, gathering firewood, or fetching water. An older child would help with the harvest, tend to the animals, or learn to spin and weave. For an artisan's child, they would start learning the family trade, sweeping the shop floor, and running errands. This was simply the economic reality of their world. The family was a unit of production, and everyone had to contribute for it to survive. But It's possible to look at this not just as a burden, but as a form of gentle, practical education that gave children a powerful sense of purpose and belonging. The work a child did was not some abstract task in a factory, it was directly connected to the well-being of their own family. When a child gathered firewood, they knew it would be used to cook their dinner and heat their home. When they helped pull weeds, they knew it would mean more food on the table. This direct connection between effort and result can be incredibly empowering. They weren't just doing chores. They were essential members of the family unit. This work was also a form of apprenticeship for life. They learned by doing, watching, and imitating the adults and older children around them. The learning was gradual and age-appropriate. A 5-year-old wasn't expected to plow a field, but they could learn to feed the chickens. A 10-year-old wasn't expected to forge a sword, but they could learn to operate the bellows. This slow accumulation of skills built a sense of competence and mastery. By the time they were teenagers, they were already highly skilled and capable individuals. This contrasts sharply with a modern childhood where many young people are kept in a state of extended dependency, separated from the world of meaningful work. They learn about the world in a classroom, but often have little practical experience of it. This can lead to feelings of uselessness and a jarring transition into the adult world. A medieval teenager, on the other hand, already knew their place in the world. They knew they were needed, they had skills, they had responsibilities. This wasn't about crushing their spirit with labor. In many ways, it was about respecting their ability to contribute. It was a system that said to a child, "You are valuable, your work matters, we need you." In its own way, that is a profoundly gentle and affirming message. Still, where is the line between empowering responsibility and harmful exploitation? In times of famine or poverty, where children worked beyond their physical limits, did this focus on practical work come at the cost of literacy and other forms of education for the vast majority of the population? And did the early entry into the world of adult work expose them to dangers, both physical and moral, that they were too young to handle? Number 5, was affection dangerous, or was it a Christian duty? Because of the staggering rates of infant and child mortality in the Middle Ages, there is a persistent theory that parents practiced a kind of emotional distancing. The idea, put forward by historians like Lawrence Stone, is that it was simply too painful to invest deep love in a child who had a high chance of dying. So, parents remained cool and detached, saving their emotional energy. Some even suggest that parents felt indifference or outright hostility towards their infants. This is one of the most pervasive myths, and it's one of the most profoundly wrong. The overwhelming evidence from personal letters, religious writings, legal documents, and even funeral effigies shows that medieval parents loved their children deeply, expressed that love openly, and grieved terribly when they died. The Christian theology itself provided a powerful mandate for parental love. Children were seen as a gift from God. The love of a parent for a child was supposed to mirror the love of God for humanity. It was a sacred duty. Writers like the 15th century Italian humanist Maffeo Veggio wrote that nature itself compels us to love our children. He and others saw parental affection not as a weakness, but as the most natural and virtuous of human emotions. We see this love in the personal records they left behind. When the children of the 15th century, passed in family in England, were sent away from home for education or service, the letters back and forth are filled with expressions of affection and concern. Mothers write about missing their children, sending them money and clothes, and worrying about their health. This is not the correspondence of detached, unfeeling parents. The grief they expressed upon a child's death is perhaps the most powerful evidence. Epitaphs on children's tombs are often heartbreaking. One from 14th century Italy for a little boy named Martin reads, "I was a sweet flower, but the brief day of my life has passed." The theologian Peter Abelard, writing in the 12th century, describes the boundless grief of a mother whose child has died. The idea that people were somehow hardened to this loss because it was common is a deep misunderstanding of human nature. The fact that it was common may have made it even more terrifying. Every parent knew the risks, and this likely made the time they had with their children even more precious. Even medical advice of the time stressed the importance of affection. It was believed that a child's emotional state directly impacted their physical health. A happy, loved child was thought to thrive, while a sad or frightened child could literally sicken and die. Therefore, showing affection, cuddling, and speaking gently to a child was not just emotionally desirable, it was considered good medical practice. They were advised to play with their infants, to smile at them, and to sing to them, all actions that build a strong emotional bond. The idea of the cold medieval parent is a modern projection born from a misunderstanding of their circumstances. They lived in a dangerous world, but they responded not with emotional shutdown, but with a fierce, protective, and deeply felt love for the children God had given them. But if this deep love was the norm, how do we account for the documented cases of child abandonment and infanticide, which were real problems in the Middle Ages? Was there a difference in the level of affection shown to sons who could carry on the family name versus daughters? And how did the theological concept of original sin, the belief that every baby was born a sinner, coexist with the idea of a child as a pure and precious gift from God in the mind of an ordinary parent? Number 4, were children's fears dismissed or were they soothed? The medieval world was full of things to be afraid of. There was the darkness of night in a world with no electric lights. There were the sounds of the forest. There was the ever-present threat of disease, famine, and violence. And there was the spiritual world, populated not just by angels and saints, but by demons, goblins, and the devil himself. It's easy to imagine a child in this world being terrified, and equally easy to imagine an adult's response being a harsh, "Don't be a baby," or "Say your prayers and go to sleep." But the methods they used to soothe children's fears were often surprisingly gentle and imaginative. They didn't necessarily dismiss the fear as irrational. Instead, they gave the child tools to manage it. The primary tool, of course, was faith. But it wasn't just a matter of abstract prayer. It was made tangible and personal. A child who was afraid of the dark wasn't just told that God was watching over them. They were taught to make the sign of the cross, a physical gesture that was believed to have real power to ward off evil. They might be given a small wearable cross or a saint's medal to touch, a physical object that served as a constant reminder of divine protection. They were taught short, simple prayers to say, like a spiritual incantation against the monsters under the bed. The names of saints, especially their own patron saint or powerful protectors like Saint Christopher, who protected travelers, or Saint Michael, the archangel, who fought the devil, could be invoked. This didn't deny the existence of scary things. It gave the child a sense of agency, a way to actively fight back against the darkness. Bedtime rituals were also important. The lullabies we've already discussed were one part of this. They filled the quiet darkness with a parent's loving voice. The final act of the day for many families would be to kneel and say prayers together. This created a sense of closure, of being safely enclosed in a bubble of divine and familial protection before entering the vulnerability of sleep. They also used stories to help children process fear. In fairy tales and folk tales, the hero often has to go into the dark forest or face a terrible monster. But the hero is brave and clever and often has some magical help. And in the end, the hero wins. These stories provided a template for courage. They showed children that fear is a normal part of life, but that it can be overcome. They acknowledged the scary things in the world, but always showed that goodness and bravery were stronger. This approach is, in many ways, very psychologically astute. It doesn't say, "Your fear is stupid." It says, "Yes, there are things to be afraid of, but you are not alone, and you are not helpless. Here are the tools, physical, spiritual, and imaginative, that you can use to be brave." It's an approach that empowers a child rather than shaming them for their feelings. But how effective were these spiritual tools against the very real fears of hunger, sickness, or the death of a parent? Did the constant talk of demons, sin, and hellfire, meant to encourage piety, actually create more profound and lasting anxiety in sensitive children? At what point does a story meant to empower a child against monsters simply introduce new monsters for them to be afraid of? Number 3 was learning by rote or through the senses. We think of medieval education as rigid and boring. We picture a schoolboy sitting on a hard bench, endlessly chanting Latin declensions, with the threat of the master's rod hanging over him. For many, this was the reality of formal education. It was heavily based on memorization and recitation. But this was only one small part of how a medieval child learned. For the vast majority of children who never went to a formal school, learning was a full-body sensory experience. It was tactile, practical, and deeply embedded in the world around them. This was a form of education that was, by its very nature, gentle and intuitive. A child learned about the world not by reading a book, but by touching, tasting, smelling, and hearing it. A baker's daughter didn't learn the theory of yeast. She learned by the feel of the dough in her hands, the smell of the baking bread, the sight of it rising. She learned the exact moment it was ready by its color, and the sound it made when tapped. This is a deep physical knowledge that cannot be taught from a page. A farmer's son learned about animals not from a textbook, but by spending every day with them. He knew the feel of a sheep's wool, the sound of a contented cow, the smell of an impending storm. He learned to predict the weather by looking at the sky and feeling the wind. This was an education in observation, in paying close attention to the world through every one of your senses. Even religious education, which we think of as highly textual, was a sensory experience for most people who were illiterate. They learned the Bible stories not by reading them, but by seeing them. The stained glass windows of the local church were their graphic novels. The sculptures and wall paintings depicted the lives of the saints and the torments of the damned. They learned theology by hearing the Mass, smelling the incense, seeing the priest's vestments, and feeling the holy water. The church was a multimedia classroom for the senses. This way of learning is gentle because it's paced to the child's own development. It's not about forcing abstract concepts into a child's head. It's about allowing them to absorb knowledge from the world around them at their own speed. It's learning by imitation, by practice, by trial and error. A child learning to weave would start with a simple task, and only when they had mastered it through physical repetition would they move on to the next, more complex step. The knowledge was built up layer by layer in their hands and muscles, not just in their minds. This sensory, hands-on approach respects the natural way that young children learn. We talked today about experiential learning and kinesthetic learners as if they are modern discoveries. But for most of human history, this was the only way of learning. It was a holistic education that engaged the whole child body, mind, and spirit. But what was lost for the vast majority of children who learned this way but never learned to read or write? How limited was their world, unable to access the knowledge and ideas contained in books? Did this purely practical sensory education stifle abstract thought, creativity, and the ability to question the world around them? And was this gentle learning simply a byproduct of a system designed to keep people in their predetermined social and economic roles for life? Number 2, were children weaned abruptly or gradually? Weaning is a major transition for a child, the first big step towards independence. Modern advice often focuses on doing it gradually, to make it as stress-free as possible for both mother and child. We might assume that in the brutal Middle Ages, weaning was a sudden and traumatic event. The child reaches a certain age, and the breast is simply taken away, perhaps with the mother putting some bitter substance on her nipple to discourage the child. Practices like that did exist. The 13th century writer Bartholomew Anglicus mentions putting mustard or wormwood on the nipple. But this was not the only or even the most recommended approach. Many medical and advice writers of the period advocated for a process that was surprisingly gradual and gentle, showing a real concern for the child's emotional well-being. First, medieval children were generally breastfed for much longer than is common in many Western cultures today. The typical age for weaning was around 2 years old, and sometimes as old as 3. This in itself is a gentle practice, allowing a child to take this step when they are more physically and emotionally ready. The advice given by physicians like the 11th century Constantine the African, whose work was highly influential, was to wean a child slowly. He and others recommended starting to introduce other soft foods long before breastfeeding was stopped entirely. It was like 3 hours. We would suggest things like bread soaked in milk or wine often watered down honey. This was a gradual process of getting the child used to new tastes and textures while still having the comfort and nutrition of breast milk. They were also very attentive to the timing of weaning. It was advised not to wean a child during the hot summer months, as they believed this was when children were most vulnerable to digestive illnesses. They also recommended avoiding weaning when the child was teething or otherwise sick. This shows a practical and compassionate concern for the child's physical health. They understood that weaning was a stress on the child's system and that it should only be done when the child was strong and healthy. There was also a concern for the child's emotional state. Rather than a sudden withdrawal of the breast, the advice was often to gradually reduce the frequency of feedings. They understood that breastfeeding was not just about food, but also about comfort and closeness with the mother. The process of introducing other foods and activities was a way of gently transferring that sense of comfort to other sources. This approach shows a deep, intuitive understanding of child development. It recognizes that major transitions should be handled with care and patience. It prioritizes the child's physical and emotional comfort. While harsh methods certainly existed, the ideal presented by the educated writers of the time was one of thoughtfulness and gentleness. They knew that a happy, secure child would weather the transition of weaning much better than one who was frightened and upset. But how much was this gentle advice, written by educated male physicians, actually followed by ordinary mothers? When food was scarce, was a mother forced to wean an older child quickly in order to provide milk for a new baby? What was the psychological effect of using bitter substances on the nipple? Did it create a sense of betrayal or rejection in the child at this crucial developmental stage? And how did the community and family support a mother and child through this sometimes difficult process? Number one, was a child's will to be broken or to be nurtured? This might be the most fundamental question in all of parenting in any era. Is a child's will something that needs to be broken and brought into submission, or is it something that needs to be understood, guided, and nurtured towards goodness? The common assumption about the Middle Ages is that they firmly believed in the former. With the doctrine of original sin, a child was born with a corrupt and selfish will. The parent's job was to break that will and impose obedience to God and to authority. There is truth to this. The concept of willfulness or pride in a child was seen as a serious spiritual danger. But the way they approached this was often far more sophisticated than simple will breaking. The most enlightened thinkers did not advocate for crushing a child's spirit. Instead, they advocated for a kind of gentle and persistent gardening of the soul. Let's return one last time to Anselm of Canterbury. His core message was that you cannot create a good person through fear and violence. He compared children to young trees. If you tie a young sapling up on all sides, it will grow into a gnarled, useless bush. But if you give it space, while gently protecting it from the winds, it will grow straight and tall. For Anselm, a child's will wasn't something to be destroyed. It was their life force, their energy. The goal was to channel that energy in the right direction. You didn't break the will, you persuaded it. You educated it, you made the child want to be good. How did they do this? Through all the gentle methods we have discussed. Through loving affection that made a child feel secure and want to please their parents. Through stories and lullabies that made virtue seem attractive and sin seem ugly. Through giving children meaningful responsibilities that built their sense of competence and worth. Through a discipline that was at its best based on reason and love rather than anger. The 15th century writer Christine de Pizan wrote a book called The Treasure of the City of Ladies, a book of advice for women of all classes. When writing about raising a daughter, she emphasizes the importance of a mother's gentle example. She says a mother should be sweet-tempered, humble, and patient. She believed a child learned virtue by seeing it and experiencing it, not by being beaten into it. She advises mothers to correct their daughters' faults, gently with kind words, because harshness only creates resentment. This is the gentle heart of medieval parenting that is so often missed. The ultimate goal was not an obedient robot. The ultimate goal was a person who freely and willingly chose to be good. They understood that you could force outward compliance with a stick, but you could only create true inner virtue with love, patience, and persuasion. Breaking a child's will might make them obedient for a time, but it would also break their spirit, creating the stupid and brutish adult the abbot complained about to Anselm. Nurturing a child's will, guiding it with reason and affection, was a much harder and longer task, but they believed it was the only way to raise a truly good and faithful human being. This is the most surprisingly gentle tip of all, that in an age we consider brutal and authoritarian, many parents and thinkers understood that the best way to raise a child was not to break them, but to carefully, lovingly, and patiently help them grow. But in a society built on a rigid hierarchy as of God over man, king over subject, husband over wife, parent over child, was this ideal of nurturing the will truly possible? How did a parent balance the need to teach obedience to authority with the desire to foster a child's inner goodness. Did this gentle approach apply equally to boys and girls, or was a girl's will seen as something more dangerous that needed to be more strictly controlled? And ultimately, in the daily struggle for survival, how often did the exhausting reality of life win out over this patient, gentle, and profoundly challenging ideal of parenting?